Now let's take a look at the Chicano movement that was forming in Denver, Colorado. One of the key figures there was a man named Rodolfo Corky Gonzalez. And Gonzalez had been politically active for some time. He took part in the Viva Kennedy clubs, which were political organizations that were trying to mobilize the Mexican American vote for John F. Kennedy in the election of 1960. Ultimately, John F. Kennedy would win that election, and afterwards, Gonzalez would take part in several programs that were related to Kennedy's war on poverty. Also, after Kennedy was assassinated, President Lyndon Johnson would also have programs related to the war on poverty, and Gonzalez would take part in those as well. And so, through his work in the war on poverty, Gonzalez ended up becoming one of the more prominent Mexican American political activists in the Denver area. He would go on to help establish a civil rights organization called the Crusade for Justice, which was a civil rights organization in 1965. The Crusade for Justice was responsible for holding a major national youth conference there in Denver in 1969. And this was the Chicano Youth Liberation Conference. At this conference, there was a plan that was created that really worked to shape the Chicano movement going forward. And this was known as the Plan Espiritual de Aztlan. And this plan recognized the indigenous roots of Mexican Americans, right? Aztlan was the homeland, the mythical homeland of the Aztecs. And many came to see the American Southwest as being this mythical Aztlan, right? So we're talking about the area that was taken from Mexico during the Mexican American War by the United States, right? So this became Aztlan. And so the plan really was based around having pride and recognizing the Chicano community and Chicano identity, to organize the Mexican and Mexican American community, right? So that they had greater political power and so that they could start their own institutions, right? Instead of focusing on integrating into the United States, they could start their own institutions, right? They could start their own schools, for example, and just their own institutions instead of trying so hard to integrate and get accepted in the United States. So, in a sense, this is a separatist movement, right? Meaning that instead of depending on the U.S. and the U.S. government to provide everything for Mexicans and Mexican Americans, they would organize themselves and start their own institutions to provide for their own community. So the Chicano Youth Liberation Conference was a major step forward in the greater Chicano movement, right? It gave a foundation and direction that the movement was moving in. So over time, the Crusade for Justice was becoming more and more public and more outspoken and critical of the city council there in Denver. Eventually, they would take part in protests against the Vietnam War. They would also support the American Indian movement, which was involved in a number of militant actions, such as the taking over of the area of Wounded Knee in South Dakota. So as the Crusade for Justice became more and more vocal and Corky Gonzalez was speaking more and more about revolution, he wasn't necessarily promoting a violent revolution, but he was talking about, a revolution, a social change, liberation for the Chicano community. As this became more and more public, you would start to see law enforcement there in Denver striking back against the Crusade for Justice organization. So members of the Crusade for Justice would be harassed, some would be arrested, and the major conflict that happened between the police department and the Crusade for Justice would take place when the headquarters of the Crusade for Justice was targeted by law enforcement. There was an explosion that happened during this attack, and we're not sure exactly what caused the explosion. There were different accounts on both sides. The Crusade for Justice said that the police department actually threw grenades into their headquarters, and that's what caused the explosion. The police department said that there were explosives being kept there by the Crusade of Justice, and they went off during the raid. But ultimately, a couple of individuals died, and several were injured during this raid on the headquarters of the Crusade of Justice. After this incident, there were a number of murders of members of the Crusade for Justice, and ultimately, all of this would lead to the decline of the organization, right? And so local law enforcement played a major role in attacking this civil rights rights organization, but also the federal government was involved. The FBI was focused and targeting the Crusade for Justice as they became more and more public. And so overall, this led to the decline of the organization, although Corky Gonzalez continued to be an important figure in the Chicano movement.